Hello, I am Ángeles Mendoza, lecturer in Environmental Planning and Management at IHE Delft. I am here in Waskaganish, a Cree community in northern Quebec, Canada. This is the Rupert River. It is used for hydropower, and when the communities had to negotiate the agreement with Hydro-Quebec, a key point was that the river will continue flowing in a way that it could allow fishing, which is a traditional activity very important for their livelihood. In this lecture on policy and legislation, we are going to see an overview of how policy and law influence the consideration of Eflows, and 3 examples will illustrate this topic. Water governance is directly related to the inclusion of Eflows in policy and legislation because it involves the rules and processes that guide decisions, the participation of actors, and the accountability for outcomes. These definitions reflect different aspects of water governance. Pause the video to read them at your own pace. To be effective, Eflows need to be included in policy and law, and have a system to evaluate that the conditions of basins are maintained as expected. Policy refers to the principles that organizations and individuals follow to achieve their objectives. Legislation refers to the laws and rules that governments enact to regulate specific areas of human activity. Legislation is needed because policy is not enforceable. National policy and legislation are influenced by international agreements. We will see examples in the following slides. To avoid conflicts between countries because of changes in shared water systems, 2 international agreements were adopted by the League of the Nations after the First World War and are still valid today. The Barcelona Convention was signed by countries of America and Europe. It bounds states to maintain the normal water conditions for navigation and considers the state's interests for irrigation and hydropower. The Convention on Development of Hydraulic Power provides that in case that a party will follow to carry out operations to develop hydropower, it has the obligation to enter into negotiations with affected riparian states. In the 1990s, other agreements were created. The ESPO Convention is relevant for Eflows because it specifies the need to consider neighbor countries when projects in one country might have transboundary impacts on other countries, like changing water levels, for example. The Helsinki Convention is a legal framework to facilitate cooperation for the protection of water quality and quantity in transboundary water bodies. It started as a regional agreement in Europe and since 2016 is open to countries outside the EU. It requires parties to use water equitably and sustainably, to prevent and control transboundary impacts and, when necessary, restore ecosystems. The UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses is the only global treaty that governs shared freshwater resources for other uses that not relate to navigation. It provides principles and rules that can be applied and adjusted to fit the conditions of specific international river courses. For many years, there have been agreements between countries to regulate water flow. For example, in 1906, Mexico and the US adopted an agreement to regulate the water flow in the Rio Grande. This specifies minimum volumes that need to be maintained to ensure the availability of water for irrigation. The Mekong River Agreement sets a framework for the sustainable use of the river basin and water resources within it. It requires cooperation to maintain a minimum flow to protect ecosystems. The Joint Committee is the entity responsible for establishing the guidelines to determine these flows. The agreement also specifies commitments to protect the basin from pollution and other impacts from development. Spain and Portugal also have signed an agreement to coordinate the use of shared waters. Initially, it was created to regulate hydropower generation, but now it includes criteria to guarantee minimum flows for other uses. The Southern Africa Development Community also has an agreement, a protocol that emphasizes the need to take a basin approach to manage water. There are other conventions that are not directly related to Eflows, but they influence the adoption of Eflows worldwide. The Convention on Wetlands, the Ramsar Convention, for example, has set now guidelines to ensure minimum flows to protect the ecological functions of wetlands. This guide calls for changing priorities for water uses and maintain environmental flow to meet the requirements of ecosystems and livelihoods downstream of dams. The World Heritage Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity are very important because they require the management of habitats or spaces to maintain their characteristics or the species that are important for mankind. You can find additional information on these conventions in the materials for this lecture. There are different aspects to consider when incorporating Eflows in policies and legislation. First is to include consumptive and non-consumptive water uses. This is important because water systems have different uses. As we can see with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework, there are cultural uses that also require the minimum maintenance of water flow. The participation of stakeholders is very important to ensure that the decisions meet different interests. Also, the water cycle needs to be considered, and that means integrating measures for surface water and groundwater and the interaction between both. Regulations usually will include methods to determine the Eflows, and policy will set the requirements to set the objectives. These two instruments are important, but Eflows will be effective if there is an independent party that can audit the performance. Let's look at some examples of how Eflows have been incorporated in policy or legislation. In Texas, for example, the water plan foresees that in 50 years there would be water scarcity. The need to protect water for the environment exists in 1917, and it was restated with amendments in 1985. However, it was until the 2000s that there were congressional discussions to implement Eflows. However, these discussions trigger fears among users, especially how it would affect water rights, if the need would be to meet environmental demands, and how these affect the plans that exist to reuse water. So the Congress created a council, and this council identified principles to implement Eflows and to guide the discussions on how it would be done. These include using sound science that should be validated, to have certainty through specific criteria that will incorporate Eflows for future planning and permitting, to ensure the balance of human needs and environmental needs, and this to be done with the regional planning with a basin-wide perspective. In the EU region, the Water Framework Directive specifies a catchment approach to manage water resources. This has influenced the adoption of national laws and policies, ordinances, or ministerial orders to implement Eflows. And this is the case, for example, of the Alpine countries, where hydropower is very related to the maintenance of flows in rivers. In Austria, for example, the ordinance sets criteria to define Eflows that include the number of years of data that should be used and requirements such as water depth, flow velocity, thermal condition, and dissolved oxygen. In France, the Environmental Code regulates minimum flows. It is enforced by the Ministry of Ecology, Sustainable Development and Energy, and it applies to new and existing infrastructure. In Italy, it is a Ministerial Decree, and this specifically for hydropower plants has big influence. The province of Brescia, for example, is one of the most important areas for hydropower generation. So the implementation of Eflows likely will imply trade-offs between Eflows and energy generation. Mexico is one of the countries where adopting Eflows is urgently needed. Mexico has extremes in water availability, floods in the south, droughts in the north. Water quality and quantity in all rivers has decreased, and the main lakes are drying out or have disappeared. Interbasin transfers are considered the solution to promote economic development and provide water for the population. So the question is, how much water will be left in the original systems? Upstream water uses do not consider downstream water needs, and before 2012 there was no regulation that could guide in how to determine Eflows. So in that year, the Ministry of Ecology issued an official norm that establishes the procedures to determine environmental flows for hydrological basins. This standard describes 4 methodologies and recognizes the need to preserve semi- and aquatic ecosystems through the maintenance of Eflows. In the diagram we see that national law in Mexico is influenced by international policy and conventions like the Ramsar Convention. This influences objectives in the National Hydrological Plan that also need to be consistent with what is specified in the Law of National Waters. And the norm on Eflows is part of this regulatory framework. To address future water scarcity, CONAGUA, the National Water Commission, the World Wildlife Fund, and Foundation Gonzalo Riarronte have promoted stakeholder forums to identify areas that could be included in the National Program on Water Research for the Environment. The goal is to establish a national system that will help support the implementation of the official norm on Eflows. Here we see in the map some of the areas that have identified as potential water reserves. In Mexico, there are 2 presidential decrees setting environmental flows for 2 environmental reserves. Rio Fuerte in the state of Sinaloa, northwest Mexico, was closed to new allocations to allow its recovery. Rio San Pedro, in the state of Nayarit, also Northwest Mexico, is within the protected area Marismas Nacionales, a biosphere reserve. The adoption of Eflows for this later case refers to the objectives set both in the management plan for the biosphere and the National Hydrological Plan and the Law of National Waters. And the allocation of Eflows is also related to other norms. The norm on water conservation and the norm on the species of plants and animals that are at risk. So in the previous slides, we have seen that policy and legislation are important to determine Eflows. And the adoption of Eflows is a step to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem services. The methodologies or values for Eflows are usually set in regulations, but this has advantages and disadvantages. And we invite you to think on what these are. All river systems are different, so it's essential to engage stakeholders in making the decisions to determine Eflows, because it's important for each one of the actors involved to understand the trade-offs. There are trade-offs between water for human consumption, water for nature, in countries with indigenous people, the needs for them, energy needs, and food security. So, we invite you to think on what do you know about the legislation that applies to Eflows in your country? Do you know what acts or regulations refer to this topic? What do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of specifying volumes in regulation? Take-home messages. We have seen that international policy and agreements influence national decisions on environmental flows. Policy and legislation set the framework for stakeholders to make decisions about environmental flows. So negotiation is important. Science provides the information about the volumes or releases needed to sustain ecological processes. However, the determination of Eflows is also a political process. Good governance will facilitate the use of scientific information so stakeholders can understand and accept the trade-offs. Negotiations are important to prevent conflicts and promote cooperation. This is the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention, and please review the references and other materials available for this unit. Have a good day.